I'm Wendy, and this is a special report with My People's TV, a history lesson, really, in the good old American vote. Let's begin. 'Twas the year 1789, America's very first election. If you were white, owned property, including human property, you were allowed to cast a vote. And that was really only 6% of the population. And guess what else? George Washington, our very first president, was our first and last independent president. At the time, he chose not to belong to either the Federalist Party or the Democratic Republican Party, whatever that was. And I only know this because I'm obsessed with Hamilton. Following the Civil War in 1870, the 15th Amendment was ratified, which gave free slaves the right to vote. But what could have been a really great step forward in American voting history was actually a really big step backwards. In 1896, Southern states passed grandfather clauses to keep former slaves and their descendants from voting. This reduced black voter population by 40%. In 1920, the 19th Amendment was finally ratified, giving women the right to vote. But it took 80 years. Women went on hunger strikes. They were force-fed. They were imprisoned. In 1924, Native Americans who weren't even considered American citizens were finally given the right to vote. In 1940, Jim Crow laws segregated whites and blacks in every which way possible, including polling stations. If you wanted to cast a vote, you had to guess how many jelly beans were inside a jar. I mean, who can do that? In 1964, the Civil Rights Act ended segregation, and in 1965, the Voting Rights Act ended racial discrimination in voting and held Southern states accountable. Here's where things get a little tricky. A provision of the Voting Rights Act ensured that states with voter suppression history were not allowed to change things like voting locations without federal approval. In 2013, the Supreme Court voted 5-4 that this was unconstitutional, which pretty much meant that they believed that because we've elected our first black president, we now live in a post-racial society. How could voter suppression even exist for people of color when we've elected our first African-American president? Makes no sense. Following this Supreme Court decision, 33 states have enacted voter ID laws that actually make it harder for people to vote. This election cycle, we've seen voter suppression rampant. In Arizona, the March 22nd primary had well over 5-hour wait lines, and for most counties, there was one polling location for every 2,500 voters. But for Maricopa County, which is mostly Latino and Native American, there was only one, just one polling location for every 21,000 voters. In April, ahead of the New York primary, 120,000 voters were purged from the Brooklyn voter registry. An investigation is ongoing in New York, and 2 election officials have been fired. But let's be honest, the investigation is being run by a superdelegate. Can the party really monitor itself? In May, the Nevada Democratic Convention clearly showed an antiquated system on delegate voting and party favoritism. And what about those that are even more marginalized? In the U.S., people of color, specifically African American and Latino men, are disproportionately incarcerated and convicted of felonies. There are only 2 states that allow inmates with felonies to vote. How can we deny the right to vote to people whose lives have been most impacted by the system? All this is what civil rights attorney and author Michelle Alexander calls the new Jim Crow, a comprehensive and well-disguised system of racialized control that functions in a manner strikingly similar to Jim Crow. And where does that leave you? Do you stand on the shoulders of men and women that have given their lives for our ability to cast a vote? Do you let your voice be heard? Or have you fallen into the trap that you believe that your vote doesn't matter? We think it does. This election matters. This is not a moment. This is a movement. This July, thousands of people will be coming from all over the country to gather at the Democratic National Convention in Philadelphia, 242 years after the first Continental Congress, by the way. The specifics will vary, but people will be demanding fundamental reforms in our political system. After all, the largest group of voters in the country, independents, have virtually no representation. Right now, roughly 26% of Americans consider themselves Republicans, 30% Democrats, and a massive 43% of Americans, much like George Washington, consider themselves independents. So get on a train, a bus, a plane, an automobile. This summer, there's only one place in America that can change the course of history. It's Philadelphia. Be there. We'll see you in Philly.